Hi, everyone. My name is Savannah Baker. I'm the president of Black Student Union, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here to be here today at the Black History Month lecture of 2025, which is really exciting. The event is meant to be continued and have a continual conversation from here on out. Tonight, we will hear a keynote lecture from Dr. McGruder, who is an associate professor of history at Antioch College. Immediately after the lecture, we will have a Q&A discussion where you will be able to ask questions via a Google form. And to submit these questions, please scan the QR code on the screen, or we have note cards for you to write your questions, and we will submit them online. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that we stand on and the labor that has shaped it. Together, we acknowledge that we gather as Hope College on traditional land of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwa people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it through generations. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoings. We acknowledge this long history of injustice and commitment to educating ourselves and our community as we seek to honor the legacy and culture of the Indigenous people. We recognize, acknowledge, and affirm the historic and contemporary solidarities and intersections between Black and Indigenous people. We acknowledge the extraction of brilliance, energy, and life for labor forced upon people of African descent for more than 400 years. As an organization, we are dedicated to advancing solutions that promote equality, dismantle oppression, and uplifts the voices and experiences of marginalized communities. We understand that acknowledging the labor of enslaved people is an essential step in addressing the historical and present-day injustices that continue to shape our society. We carry our ancestors with us, and we continually are calling ourselves to be better. We commit to dismantling racism in spaces of work, and we invite you to work besides us to create change. As a student and part of Black Student Union, we are so grateful to the Culture and Inclusive Excellence Division and the Center for Diversity and Inclusion for their support in sponsoring this program. Again, thank you for coming to this lecture, and I hope you enjoy it. But more importantly, I hope you learn something new from it that will inspire you. Next, I would like to introduce you all to Naomi Oliver Martins, Public Relations Chair for the Black Student Union, who will be reading two poems. The first one is Caged Bird by Maya Angelou, and the second, I Dream a World by Langston Hughes.
Hi, everyone. Like Savannah said, I'm Naomi, and the first poem I'll be reading is Caged Bird. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wings in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. And his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade wind soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still. And his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. And the last poem I'll read is I Dream a World by Langston Hughes. I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth, and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice brights our day. A world I dream where black or white, wherever race you may be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free. Where wretchedness will hang its head in joy like a pearl, attends the needs for all mankind of such a dream, my world. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lanaya Dennis, and I serve as the Vice President of the Black Student Union. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today for the 2025 Black History Month lecture, Dr. Kevin McGruder. Dr. Kevin McGruder is an Associate Professor of History at Antioch College. His interest in community formation led to a career in community development. Now, as an academic, his research interests include African American institutions, urban history, and LGBTQ plus history. He has a BA in economics from Harvard University and MBA in real estate finance from Columbia University, and a PhD in U.S. history from the City University of New York. He is a co-author of the book Witness, 200 Years of African American Faith and Practice at the Abyssinian Baptist Church of Harlem, New York, and the author of Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, and Philip Payton, the father of Black Harlem and editor of Home at Last, the collected writings of AIDS journalist Leroy Whitfield. He is a producer of Loud as the Rolling Sea, a podcast focusing on African Americans past and present in Yellow Springs, Ohio, that is broadcast on WYSO public radio station. Today's lecture is titled, We Sure Do Need It Now, Developing a Plan to Counter the Attacks on Efforts to Achieve a More Equitable Society, which will reflect on the national demonstration that followed the May 2020 murder of George Floyd and how it led to a broadening of stated commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that were quickly met with a very skilled campaign to distort their purposes, and more recently, to dismantle many such programs on college campuses and private industry. The goal of the original initiatives, achieving a more equitable society, is still needed. What can we do to achieve this goal? Now please welcome Dr. Kevin McGruder.
First, I want to start off by thanking Javon Willis, the director of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, for the invitation to be here. And then also I want to thank the students, Savannah, Naomi, Lanaya, and thanks in advance to Nyla, who were all participating in this and making this happen. I was here the first week of November for the Students of Color Leadership Conference, so it's great to be back. When Javon invited me to speak, and I was thinking about what I would talk about, and this was in the late fall, a lot of things that are happening now had not yet happened, but what came to mind to me is a gospel song that was written by Thomas Dorsey in 1943, and I want to play just a little bit of it. And the group is the a cappella group Take Six. They premiered this, their premiere album was in 1988, and this is from that album.
If we ever needed the Lord before, we sure do need him now. Oh, we sure do need him now. Oh, Lord, we sure do need him now. If we ever needed the Lord before, we sure do need him now. We need him every day and every hour. If we ever needed the Lord we sure do need him now. Oh, we sure do need him now. Oh, Lord, we sure do need him now. If we ever needed the Lord before, we sure do need him now. We need him every day and every hour. We need him.
I'm going to stop it there. The I don't know what the impetus for Thomas Dorsey writing that was, but in 1943, we were in the middle of the Second World War. He was in Chicago, and black people were fighting a war for what they called the double V: victory against fascism and Nazism in Europe, and victory against racism and segregation at home. And to some extent, we are still, at least the at-home part, we're still fighting it. It might not be overt segregation, but there's definitely work to do. And that's what I want to talk about today. And what I'm going to do is give you a little bit more about who I am, then talk about what I study, and it's going to be very brief, and then move into what I believe regarding equitable society, and then what I think we can do. And I don't think I'm a genius, so it's not like the one answer, but I'm really drawing on my background. And so first, who I am, and I've never done this before. I speak several times a year. But one of the reasons why I wanted to go deep into who I am is because I think one of the things that is keeping us from hearing each other when we disagree is that we're not seeing our humanity. And I'm a person. I have a background. It's not just my degrees. I'm a twin. That's a picture of me and my sister Karen in 1957, soon after we were born. Not sure what happened to that picture. Let's see if I can change it. No, can't. Sorry. Well, there's five. I'm from a family of five, and that was taken in 1983 for our parents' 30th anniversary. It was a surprise. I am very involved in my family, my church. The picture on the left is at Warren AME Church in Toledo, Ohio, where I grew up. My mother was getting the Mother of the Year award in 2003, and so that's why she has a flower. And they do it on Mother's Day, and it's a surprise. And so I was living in New York at that time, and my two brothers were in D.C. My sister was also in New York. So we all came in. It was a Sunday, and she didn't know that we were in town until the church service. And my father got the award the next year, and they both deserved it. So that's the kind of background I have. And the next picture is from my life at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. That's the church that Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and Jr. Were pastors, senior from 1908 to 1937, junior from 1937 to 1972, while he was also a congressman. The last Sunday of June of every year, they give out these awards. One is the Doctor of Goodwill, the Doctor of Victorious Living, and I can never remember the third one, but I got the Doctor of Goodwill Award. It's the honorary award. And that's Calvin Butts III, the pastor at that time, who died in 2022. And on the left is Violet Deese, who was the assistant pastor at the time. And what Dr. Butts said when he gave that to me, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, even when we disagree, he finds a way to wrap his arms around us. And what he was talking about is the fact that I am Christian and I'm gay. And at the time that I came out to him, I was working at the Abyssinian Development Corporation as Director of Real Estate Development. The reason why I came out to him was because he was starting a campaign against misogynist lyrics in hip-hop music. This is in the 1990s. And I was a member, and still am a member, of Gay Men of African Descent, which is an organization in New York. And we wanted him to say something about homophobic lyrics as well. And he didn't. And I wasn't involved in those conversations, but the people within GMAT who were said that, well, we're going to protest wherever he goes, from now on. And I felt I was going to get squeezed because they were going to, blindside him. Did you know Kevin McGruder is gay? And I didn't want him, that. And so we had a conversation, and that led to, over the years, many conversations. He was trying to make the church welcoming, but he had a conservative interpretation, as many do, about the place of gay people within the church. And so I was navigating that, and still am, because I'm still a member of that church as well as a church in Yellow Springs. And this is my partner, Larry McGruder, who does not like to sit and listen to people talk for a long time, so that's why he's not here today. What I do, as the introduction said, I've been working in community development for a long time. And so I bring that lens in a lot of different ways, kind of street level, but also as an academic. The picture on the left, now that I'm back in Ohio, I've been doing that. That was at a demonstration. It was related to transgender rights at Courthouse Square in Dayton. And then the picture on the right, in Yellow Springs, we have an African-American history walking tour program where we train middle school and high school students to be tour guides. And we offer tours on Saturdays from June to August. And so that's me and one of the members of our organization, the 365 Project, that sponsors that. When I went back to graduate school, I was 44 when I entered the doctoral program. And I had a career in community development. And I wasn't trying to leave that behind, but I was bridging that. And so what I began using is, the world I knew and studying it from an academic point of view. And this is one of the articles that I wrote. It's about Other Countries, which is a Black gay men's writing group in New York that I'm still a part of. And those are early pictures of them. And the one on the right is, we had a journal that came out in 1993, so we were in Boston at a conference selling those. Gay Men of African Descent, I was executive director of that group from 1997 to 2001. And that's at the time when HIV and AIDS was a major challenge in the Black community. It's still a challenge, although people don't necessarily recognize it, and those are pictures from some of the things that we were doing. But how I get to my interest in race and real estate goes back to Toledo, where I grew up. The picture on the left, that's me and 4 of my siblings in 1960. And that's my father when he was 31. And we just came across this picture in the last year or so. So it's fascinating to, kind of see us at that age. The picture on the right, I just found this past week. That house has been demolished maybe about 15 years ago. That's where we were living in 1960. Our 5th sibling was born in 1964, and when my mother was pregnant, that's a 2-bedroom house, which it didn't seem small. You see, we're all, we're under. My oldest brother is, how old was he then? He was 7 then. So when you're little, it's not an issue if you're all sleeping in one bedroom. But they started looking for other houses, and they decided to build this house. This is a picture from 2019, so it looks a little different than it did when we first moved in. But the neighborhood we moved to was on the edge of the town in Adams Township. And it was about 50% Black, 50% white. In 66, we moved there in 64. In 66, it was annexed into the city. And it went from 50% white and 50% Black to 90% Black within 2 to 3 years. And as a child, I'm not analyzing that, but I do remember. And the white children that lived in our neighborhood did not go to our school. They went to Catholic schools. And I always wonder, well, what's going on there? And, now as a scholar, I know what was going on was white flight. And it has its roots in systemic practices related to race. And I began looking at that when I was at Harvard. This is a paper from 1978. I'm not showing it just because it was an A-. So, in economics, if it was a C, I probably wouldn't have it up there. But what I was looking at then, this is a junior seminar, and it was called The Economics of Discrimination. Segregation pays. That's why it's hard to get out of it. When you can steer black people to one area, you can charge them more, you can give them less. And so I was looking at how that happened in Toledo. And then once I got my PhD, my dissertation became the Race and Real Estate book, and then the Philip Payton book. And now those are focusing on Harlem, really that same thing. And the reason I'm going into this is we're living in a time now where people are saying there's no such thing as systemic racism. And the real estate industry, there is incontrovertible evidence that there is. And so what I looked at in Harlem, there's something called racial restrictive covenants that many people began to put in their deeds. And they say, in New York, this is 1907 to about 1913, they're doing it. One said, no Negro, mulatto, quadroon, or octoroon can live in this property. And it didn't just, because it's in the deed, it's not just the person who signed it that has to adhere to that. Anybody who buys a property does that. And that was happening across the country by the 1920s. So that's just an example. But what that does is what it's doing is codifying racism. And the real estate industry is writing race into housing. And the same thing is happening more broadly. This book, The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, looks at how criminality is, how race is written into criminality through the census records. And blackness gets tied to crime. And really the way that happens is crimes like loitering or things like that are particularly targeting black people who are moving in larger numbers to northern cities. And the white people who live there are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with that. And so the law is used to surveil them. And because of that, you see more black people in crime statistics. And even scholars in the North, they analyze that and say, well, there's something about blackness that's leading to that crime, rather than the other side. It's something about the way we're creating our laws. And so what that has to do with this historical moment is that we are definitely in a cycle where progress by black people creates a backlash. And in this case, it's a backlash related to anti-racism efforts. And so anti-racism, as I'm using the definition, that it's the practice of actively identifying and opposing racism. And I believe that a lack of integrity and a desire to maintain white dominance in all areas of society are the motivating factors behind these efforts. And just to maybe give you a preview of what I'm going to go into more detail in a few minutes, that the situation calls for strategic actions by individuals and organizations. It's necessary to create a strong counter-narrative demonstrating that we all benefit from a more equitable society. As well, it's important to have a multi-pronged campaign of public education, community organizing, and political organizing to persuade a sufficient amount of people that a more perfect, equitable union is still possible. And the things that are needed, we need to gain a clear understanding of the history and motivations of similar historical backlashes. We need to draw on the resources of coalitions, of advocacy organizations to implement this multi-pronged attack. We need to amplify voices of religious leaders, and that's why I'm talking about my navigating Christianity as a gay person, because I think there's an opportunity for Christians to and other religious leaders to play an important role. And then we need to continue political organizing, but do it more effectively. And so when we think about how did we get here, so we're in a period of racial retrenchment. And it may seem unique, but it really is not. It's part of a backlash. And just to kind of briefly see how we got here. The murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012 by George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watchman in Florida. Trayvon Martin was a 15-year-old teenager watching football with his father. He takes a break to go to the store, get some Skittles and I think iced tea, and it's a community that has a neighborhood watch. On his way back home, George Zimmerman sees him. He has a hoodie on with it over his head. George Zimmerman calls into the police and says, I think I see somebody suspicious, and runs up on him. He's a grown man, and Trayvon Martin, like a 15-year-old will do when they're confronted, eventually defends himself and gets shot in the heart and ends up dead. And George Zimmerman initially wasn't even arrested. It was only demonstrations that led to that. And that's really where the phrase Black Lives Matter comes from, that it was coined during that term because it was so clear that his life didn't matter. And that's the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. It accelerates 2014 to 2020 when there's a succession of Black people killed by the police. There are people killed by the police every year. But I think what made it different here is the technological advances of cell phones that had cameras and videos on them. And so not only were we seeing names, often we were seeing the actual murders. And that leads to an outcry demonstrations and the focus on the inequality, first focusing on police, but then more broadly. And, probably the pinnacle of this was the May 2020 murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, where he is alleged to have given a store owner a counterfeit $20 bill. The store owner called the police. He was sitting in his car. Police comes up to him, tells him to get out. Next thing you know, the policeman has his knee on George Floyd's neck. And there's a woman who is your age who is standing there, the student's age, who gave these introductions, who had the presence of mind to tape it all, even though they told her to stop. And so that's why we know his name, and that led to a whole nother level, really worldwide, nationwide. And it also put pressure on corporations, on colleges and universities to do something about it. And they responded in many ways, often some with money, some with commitments of sometimes it was statements, but it was a mix of ways that they responded. And what has happened to this, what has led to the backlash, is that the media has been used to demonize these efforts to move toward equality. I began writing about it because I thought it was just a matter of people not understanding. And if you remember, it started with people talking about CRT, or critical race theory. So I teach history. I study that. I didn't study it closely, but I knew what it was. But that's like a grad school thing, and they're claiming that children in elementary school are being taught that. And so this op-ed is pretty much saying this is what it is. No, it's not being taught. And I was naive enough to think, okay, once we educate, then they'll drop off of that. But the more I researched it, I realized that, and this is something else I wrote for the American Association of University Professors, the same kind of thing. But I realized it was a campaign, and it was constructed by this man, Christopher Rufo. He's a journalist with the City Journal, which is Journal of the Conservative Manhattan Institute. And it was very, very effective. And what he said, this is an article about his efforts in the New Yorker, but he says, the goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have codified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. So a lot of people don't know what critical race theory is, but they know what he said it is, which what he says it is diversity trainings, all of that, which it is not. What it is it's really going back to the real estate industry. Like, why is racism still there? And it's because even though people might be well-meaning, when you're acting in a system that has it built in, you are employing some of those mechanisms and implicit biases from that past system. And this is a painting by Jonathan Harris, who is really depicting what we're experiencing now, where there are some schools who are wondering, could they have programs like this? Can we talk about Black history? And so that's the level of effectiveness he's had and then it expanded to divisive concept laws, to what I'm calling anti-DEI movement or a DEI scare. It's almost like, oh, you can't say DEI, no, can't say. And it's national now, and now it's been incorporated into the federal government. The previous backlash, one that's somewhat similar, is the post-Reconstruction backlash. Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1876, when slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment gives birthright citizen, particularly for Black people, because we were not citizens, according to the 1857 Dred Scott Law, whether we were free or enslaved. So even though you end up in slavery, Black people were not citizens unless you have that 14th Amendment. That's why we have birthright citizenship. It does a lot of other things, too. 15th Amendment gives Black men the vote, and then you get Black elected officials, and you get them at all levels. The picture on the left is Frederick Douglass and 2 Black senators from Mississippi. At that time, senators were elected by state legislators, and Mississippi was a majority Black state, so it's not a surprise they elect Black men. Blanche Bruce on the left and Hiram Rebels on the right, and that's Frederick Douglass in the middle. And then you have Black men in Congress as well. Eventually, you have hundreds of Blacks in leadership at the state level, local level, and the backlash begins to describe that as Negro domination. Like only Mississippi and South Carolina is there a Black majority, but just the movement of Black people up is seen as domination. These are cartoons from Harper's Weekly, and the one on the left is, kind of a ridiculing Black people in leadership. The one on the right is depicting what becomes known as the redemption movement. So Christianity is very much a part of the backlash. The Ku Klux Klan, if I remember right, the full name is something like the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. If you look at their initial uniform, it had a cross on the tunic there. And so they used the language of Christianity to say, we're going to redeem the South for white people. And they're using the term white supremacy boldly at that time. People kind of shy away from it now, but they were very bold in it. And so the cartoon on the right is showing that redemption. And that opens up the area of Jim Crow, which is segregation laws all throughout the South. 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision says it's constitutional to require segregation. But Black people weren't just like sitting there and saying, oh no, what can we do? They responded. You get HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities. You get black churches, black fraternal organizations. You also get black migration to the north as well as to the west. Kansas and Nebraska, black towns are being formed. And then you have decades of legal challenges that eventually leads to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And that's the beginning of the dismantling of segregation and opening up what we now call the modern civil rights movement. And so all of those things are happening. And the reason I'm going into it is it doesn't have to take us 60 years to push back what's happening now, but there's things that we will need to do. And part of it is understanding how what has been done happened. And so Christopher Rufo and his work was just one element of a broad network. In the book State Capture, How Conservative Activists, Big Business, and Wealthy Donors Reshaped American States, the author Alexander Hertel Fernandez, so he describes a conservative organization troika. And one of the organizations is the American Legal Exchange, or ALEC. And so if you wonder why the legislation of divisive concepts was so similar state by state and why you have it in that map, it's because that's what they do. They create model legislation, send it out, and then people just kind of change the letterhead and put state of whatever on it and move forward. But there's, in addition to that legislative side, there's the State Policy Network, which I had never heard of before. Most of us probably haven't, but they're a huge organization. It's an association of 66 state-level think tanks. They research conservative issues, and they focus on market-oriented policy throughout the country to push forward their views. And then another organization does the grassroots organizing, the Americans for Prosperity. They were started by the Koch brothers. And so when you see demonstrations with a lot of people focusing on conservative issues, often they have a role in that. There are some other organizations too, the Heritage Foundation, which you're probably familiar with, which started in 1973. One of the key things they began doing with the election of Ronald Reagan is creating something called Mandate for Leadership for the president to consider this is how you can move forward a conservative agenda. The first one they did was this one in 1981. The most recent one they did, we call it Project 2025. But that's why all of these things have moved so fast, is because they're executing their plan. The courts have changed a lot in the last 10 years or so, and a lot of it has to do with Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. They create a list of pre-vetted potential candidates for different judge positions at the federal level, from Supreme Court, U.S. District Court, and when there are vacancies, conservatives who are in decision-making positions look at that list. And so when we look at even how the Supreme Court has tilted, they have a lot to do with that. But don't despair, because it could make you think, oh, we can't do anything. I think there's a temptation to build a mirror image. And when I look at what they're doing and kind of what we're living through now, and particularly how Republican congressmen who used to be moderate are kind of falling in line. There's an authoritarian element to that, where you keep that party line and you don't deviate from it, or you will be punished. I'm not suggesting that that's what the response should be. What I am suggesting, and in part another reason, is because it's founded on a succession of lies. Like, the fact that when C.Q. Brown was fired on Friday, that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, as we say in the black community, had the nerve to set his mouth to question his qualifications when he was a 4-star general, been an F-16 pilot, and when we look at Pete Hegseth, it's like, well, what have you done? Like, nothing comparable. And so, and very few people point that out because there's been a slide. That's a lie. That is a lie. And so I don't think a successful movement can be built on lies and enduring. I'm not saying they've been successful, but I'm not sure that they can endure. And I don't think it's just wishful thinking. But when I think about a strategy to counter it, I think it needs to be based on the truth, but it also needs to be strategic. And what we don't necessarily recognize is we have a wealth of organizations working for equitable society, and some of them are already at work. You've seen the cases that the ACLU has brought. They're doing it. And just to remind us, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, that's where Brown versus Board of Education comes through. And I'm putting their budgets here too because they have a comparable amount of money. So don't think that the conservatives are like outspending us, really. I think they are. So in economics is we have a market economy. There are some economies that are called command and control, and that's when communism was really communism. That's what it was, where Mr. Big says, do it, and it gets done. They've got a command and control version of their organization when, whoever Mr. Big is, I think there are a couple of them, do it, get done. I'm not suggesting that. Let me not go there. So the ACLU, $146 million budget. They got a lot of money. Southern Poverty Law Center. They're also challenging, doing work, great work. Transgender Law Center. The reason I give a page for them is transgender people have been particularly targeted, even though they only make up 1% of the population. And so that's another lie, but it's a lie that is endangering people, and their budget is $16 million, and their executive director happens to be chair of the Antioch College board, so that's how I'm really familiar with what they're doing. Lambda Legal Defense, marriage equality, in part, they played an important role in it with the Human Rights Campaign. The American Association of University Professors, and this book on the right that I have a chapter in, The Right to Learn, came out in 2024. And the subtitle was Resisting the Right Attack on Academic Freedom. And so these organizations are not kind of sitting here flat-footed. One organization I had not heard of before, State Innovation Exchange, they don't quite do what ALEC does, but they do work with state legislators who are progressive legislators to make sure they understand the issues. And then on the religious side, the National Council of Churches, the Anti-Defamation League, Muslim Legal Fund, the Baha'i International Community. And one of the reasons I have them, so I have several friends in Yellow Springs. They're members of the Yellow Springs Baha'i Center, and so I've become more familiar with the faith. It starts in the late 1800s, and the core tenet is the unity of humanity. And so from the very beginning, they are bringing people together across racial lines. And so I think they have a role to play. The other reason why I'm bringing in religion is because religion has been co-opted by this movement, where to make it seem, so if you think about the pushback that the pastor Bude, who was the priest at the Washington National Cathedral, on the inauguration day, the tradition is that the president goes to the National Cathedral, and the pastor gives a sermon, kind of preparing the president for what they might, from a spiritual point of view, what they might consider. And what she asked him to consider is mercy. And the pushback was hard because how dare she? She's insulting him. And it's like, have you read your Bible? It's like, if Christianity is built on healing the sick, feeding the hungry, raising the dead, clothing the naked, helping with the least of these, that's not the Christianity of white nationalism. And that's why Christians and other faith organizations have a role to play in pushing this back and working in coalition. So I can't say that there's the sophisticated network of these organizations like on the conservative side, but there doesn't really need to be. People work in coalition. So I was at Gay Men of African Descent, executive director, in the 90s when marriage equality was moving its way up. And there was an executive directors group of executive directors of LGBTQ organizations. We met every other week, and it's and a therapist was the facilitator because it's like leading these organizations at that time, and it was important. But also, what came out of that, those relationships, like if there was something going on, we all knew about it, and we were part of a national network, and that still exists. And that's what I know about the LGBTQ community, but these other movements too. There are coalitions that might not be as formal as on the conservative side, but they exist. And we've done this before. And these are some examples. The anti-slavery movement, it was a coalition movement. 1770s to 1865, from the manumission societies of the 1770s to into the Civil War and the 13th Amendment, victory. Women's rights movement, 1840s, 1970s, civil rights movement. That was a coalition. If you look at the video, the full video of the March on Washington, although there's less and less of it online now, you see, like people tend to think of the civil rights movement as a black movement, but black people were at the center of it. But there were a lot of other organizations there as well. And multiracial, it was a multiracial coalition. The anti-war movement, similarly. The LGBTQ rights movement, same. The AIDS and HIV treatment movement, which is kind of starting to be forgotten, but I lived through it, so I know a fair amount about it. So the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, was multiracial organization that linked up with organizations like GMAT. And then marriage equality. All of these were coalitions that had success. So that's on the organizational side. On the political side, electoral politics, so that mandate for leadership that the Heritage Foundation writes when the conservative becomes president, I really push us to look at it more carefully, because just because somebody's elected doesn't mean they have a mandate. So what a mandate suggests is they got an overwhelming majority. The president who is in place now won by less than 2% of the popular vote. That's not a mandate. Now, when you look at the Electoral College, there's a bigger gap. And so that leads to some, and then when we look at Congress, it's definitely not a mandate in the House of Representatives. There's a gap of 2 seats between Democrats and Republicans. The Senate, it's a bigger gap, but still, not overwhelming. So what that suggests is short term, we should be, people who are interested in an equitable society and electoral politics should be working to support strong candidates for 2026, the midterm congressional elections, and working to identify strong candidates for the 2028 presidential election primaries. And longer term, in Ohio has been gerrymandered so that the election results do not reflect the voter registration. And I don't know the exact statistics off the top of my head, but I think it's probably, maybe 60% Republican. No, it's 55% Republican, 45% Democrat, something like that. But the way the gerrymandering works out, it's 70% of those electoral seats controlled by Republicans. And so short term, that's something to focus on. There was an attempt to do that last year, but the Secretary of State confused people with the language that he put into that. So I'm sure that's going to happen. There'll be attempts to do that again. In other states where there's a mismatch between the voter registration and the results. And then another, which is a longer term, is to work to change the winner-take-all politics. That's why you have such a mismatch between the popular vote and the electoral vote. The Constitution, Article 2, gives the states exclusive control of the choice of awarding their electoral votes. And I'm not sure exactly when, but the states, most of them, decided to reward all of the votes to the person who wins, but it doesn't have to be that way. And there's a movement now, it's called the National Popular Vote movement, for states to decide to reward their electoral votes to the one who wins the popular vote in their state. And the way this would work is they need a certain number of states to enter into the agreement. And they need 7. It's been enacted by 17 states, and those states control 209 of the 270. So if they can get enough of the states to get up to that 270, then this could bring the electoral vote in alignment with the popular vote. Kind of moving to a close, the DEI scare, it does have historical examples. I've been thinking about this from the beginning. This is a poster for the play The Crucible by Arthur Miller. I don't know if any of you read that in high school or here, but it's a play set in the time of the Salem witch trials in the 1690s, but it's used as a metaphor to talk about the Red Scare of the 1960s, which is the anti-communist scare. And there are definitely connections between the two and to this current moment. The witch trials begin in January 1692 when the daughter and niece of a Salem minister became ill. And the village doctor diagnosed bewitchment. Accusations spread, and more than 200 people were accused. One of the reasons they spread was because that was in New England, part of Christian beliefs, that witchcraft was a sign of the devil. But they had rules in terms of evidence they needed. There's an excellent book called In the Devil's Snare by Mary Beth Norton. If you're interested in that, read it, because it goes into a lot of detail about what happens, why. And just briefly, the people who end up targeted, typically they're people who are marginalized for some reason, or they're women who are a little too independent. And so there's these ways that it plays out. And it's happening from 1692 to 1693. The trials resulted in executions of 19 people, and many more were jailed. And they ended, Mary Beth Norton says they ended when the governor, who had been away for a long time, returned. And then all of a sudden people are asking, well, why did we do that? How did we do that? The Red Scare, there's some parallels there. That is Roy Cohn and Joseph McCarthy. So the Red Scare doesn't begin with Joseph McCarthy. The first is right after World War I. After the Russian Revolution, so the Soviet Union becomes communist, people are afraid of communists. And so there's a Red Scare where the federal government raids organizations in 1919. Things die down, but then by the 50s, Joseph McCarthy, he was a junior senator from Wisconsin, and in February of 1950, he claimed, and he did like this: I have before me a list of 250 people in the federal government who are communists. And nobody ever saw that list, but he manipulated the media, and people were afraid of communism. and it ends up with people being targeted, and often kind of parallel to, there's some parallels with the witch trials. Gay people are targeted as security risks because it's assumed, well, you're gay, and they're not using the term gay, then they're probably using queer or something in the negative way, not the way we use it now. And it falls apart when Joseph McCarthy, there are hearings that were televised, and he's claiming there are communists in the army. And there's an attorney that he tried to go after, and somebody supports this attorney. And at one point, somebody defending the attorney tells Joseph McCarthy, "Have you no shame?" And it's almost like an emperor's new clothes moment that people seem to kind of realize how far he's gone. And I'm not saying we're going to have a moment like that, but just maybe to pick up on that thread. So Roy Cohn, there's a movie out now called The Apprentice. I haven't seen it yet, but it talks about the relationship between Donald Trump and Roy Cohn. So Donald Trump's use of the law, that's Roy Cohn. That's his strategy. So there's a link between what we're seeing now and what was happening then. There's also a link. So what I'm calling the DEI scare, if we look at actually both the Salem witch trials, the first person to be accused is a woman named Tituba. And there are various accounts of who she was. Some say she was an indigenous servant. Some say she was indigenous and of African descent. And the fact that she is the first to be accused. I think the DEI scare, part of it is a fear of blackness in some ways, or black achievement. Like, you can be black as long as you stay down there, but once you start coming up, we're going to be afraid of you. The Red Scare works the same way. Civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, others were accused of communism by J. Edgar Hoover, who felt that the black organizations were the biggest threat to the country, even though most of them only had, like a few thousand members at the most. And I do think that's a thread that's running through to what we're experiencing now. And part of it is that the DEI scare promoters, they're responding to the white grievance that scholars identify growing during the presidency of Barack Obama and generating the election skepticism that followed Donald Trump's defeat and in the 2020 election. And although Donald Trump won the 2024 election, the white grievance that he and his allies confirmed cannot merely disappear. Like they're saying, you should have these jobs, not this black person. And it's being used to mobilize support for his policies. And so concluding that this current backlash to efforts to achieve an equitable society, it follows the patterns that we've seen previously. Response needs to be multi-pronged. We have the organizations to do it, working in coalition. We need to understand this history, and I still do believe that it's possible for us to achieve a more perfect union. And just the reason I'm saying that's the preamble of the Constitution. And so all these people talking about being for the Constitution, that's what the Constitution claims it was being written to do, to create a more perfect union. And I do think that's still possible. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nyla Burnett, and I have the honor of being the Secretary of Hope's Black Student Union. First off, I want to thank you all for being here today and for showing up not only to celebrate Black History Month, but to hear from our incredible Dr. Kevin McGruder.
Thank you.
Of course. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A section. So, If you got any questions, and I know that you guys do, you can just go ahead and scan the QR code that's on the screen, and then you can submit those. And if you're more of a pen and paper person, we do have people to go around with note cards, and then you can write that down, and then it will be submitted for you. So let's get into the Q&A section. So Dr. Kevin McGruder, your research includes African American institutions and urban history. And like you said inside of the lecture, you talked about those types of institutions. How have historically Black institutions like churches, HBCUs, or community groups played a role in resisting systemic inequities, and how can they continue to do so today?
So that period, Reconstruction and afterward, is when the Black church is growing dramatically. 1865, actually through the rest of the 1800s. And it's growing because Black churches are more than just places of worship. Often that's where the schools that become HBCUs, they often starting in Black churches. They're for Black men, they become opportunities for leadership, visible leadership. Whether they have an education or not. For educated men, it's one of the few options that they have. For women as well, there would be no Black church without Black women who, like you can look at any congregation and you go on early on a Sunday morning and who's like getting everything in order is usually Black women are in large part, and so they're playing a role there. The Black club movement begins in the latter part of the 1800s too, and so we now look at like women's social clubs, white women as well. We think it's just ladies who lunch, but they are eating lunch, but they're organizing too. They're creating networks. They're by the progressive era, so the progressive era, 1870s going forward, where they're trying to change their neighborhoods. YMCAs, YWCAs. So Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist, becomes an activist. She moves to Chicago in the latter part of the 1800s, and she's trying to do things for her children. So my Race and Real Estate book, what I was trying to do is explain, so Black people in the North, as they move in large numbers, people tend to write about them just like a bunch of Black people. And that word ghetto kind of gets glommed under them, and people don't break it apart. They don't see it as a community. And what I was looking at, they're forming music schools for their children, recreation, all of those kinds of things. So all of these become, and often they're under the radar. Like in the South, they're doing it too in the midst of segregation. And a lot of the Southerners don't even understand it. They tell, oh, that music sounds so good. And it's like, that's all they're understanding. They don't understand what else is happening. So, yeah, they're doing that today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, you created the book Race and Real Estate, Conflicts and Corporations in Harlem. How do current housing policies continue to impact the Black communities, and what can be done to promote more equitable housing opportunities, especially considering the new administration?
The homeownership rate, there's a big gap between Black homeowners and white homeowners. And it's about a 30% gap. And that's kind of been there throughout the 20th into the 21st century. And the reasons behind it, some of it is income, that average income is less. But even like studies show when you control for income and credit history, that Black people get denied in homeowner loans at higher rates than white people. And the Federal Reserve has done some research on it, and they cannot explain it. Some of it, they say they know is related to implicit bias, but they're not sure what the rest is. And I think it might be I'm not sure what tool they're using to determine implicit bias, but the reason I went into that history of Blackness getting conflated with inferiority, that's like almost 150 years of that in our culture. And so it's built in ways that we don't even realize. And so that's a lot of it is that. And to change it, it really takes aggressive monitoring of banks. And they do have to report when they decline. They do have to report. But there's a way that they can say other. And who knows what that is. And so it would take that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that can be anything. Mm-hmm. So, many students and young people are passionate about fighting for justice and often feel discouraged by the setbacks. What advice would you give to young people and young activists who want to create meaningful change and lasting change in their communities?
To really study movements that, because there's so much video now, and particularly the March on Washington, so it's the high point of the civil rights movement, and I think people think that the march was the main thing, and they don't see like the 10 years before of organizing leading up to it. And so so nonviolent direct action, that's the tactic that the civil rights movement is using. And what they're doing is creating pressure to bring people to the negotiating table so that it can bring about change. What a march does is it can raise visibility, it can create pressure, but once you've created pressure, you've got to figure out, even when you're deciding on a march, you've got to figure out, so that picture of me at Courthouse Square, I remember now, there was a march, and it was led by somebody, I've been in a lot of marches, but it was led by somebody who I don't think knew what I'm describing now, because we were in downtown Dayton on the streets, we didn't have a permit, and we didn't know we were going to be on the streets, and that's a mistake already, and a lot of them were students, and so I felt, okay, I need to try to, and I'm saying that as an example that was a march, but it didn't lead to anything. And that's one, but also to understand that some of these movements took years. And so I know when you're 18 or 19, you do want to see something soon, but often it's going to take a while. So John Lewis, he was that age when he began doing all this. And he begins that in about 60, 63, he's at the March on Washington. That was relatively quick, but everything wasn't done. And that's why he goes to Congress. So part of it is realizing that it's going to take a while. You do have to be strategic. And like the Black Lives Matter movement, I haven't studied it carefully, but it got a lot of visibility. But like there were some strategic reasons why they didn't have one leader. Because what they learned from the movements of the 60s, that leader gets killed often, or people come for them. So you can't like name one person with them. But the other part of it is there's no like coordination. And so it was very loose. And so it's a complicated answer maybe. Like there's several levels. Like organizationally, there needs to be organization, there needs to be tactics. People need to think about what's going to be happening. And there are organizers in the Midwest who can help with that. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I didn't include them in this, but there are people who are doing that and can help. And so that's the other part of it, is learn from people who are doing it.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that participation in these social events are important, but organization behind it is way more important.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on into the audience's questions now. Someone asks, how can small local efforts more effectively merge larger, better noticed movements?
Linking up in coalition. So we're in Michigan. There's a Michigan ACLU. many organizations have statewide networks, and if you're doing something, let's say you're doing something in Holland, depending on what it is, think about what organization might be doing something nationally, what organization is doing something statewide, connecting with them. Often, like, they cannot be everywhere, so they need you locally. And that's what I mean about the coalition work, is without it, like, we're expecting this central body to do everything, but they can't be everywhere. And the other advantage of local organizing is, like, the needs are different. The people who are available are different. Like, you can tell them something about your local area that somebody, even in the state capitol, might not know. And so linking up with statewide and national organizations would be a good way to do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question is, what can we do right now to stop the anti-DEI movement we are seeing? How do we make these illegal actions accountable?
I mean, one thing I think can be done is to press Congress, people who represent you in Congress, to say something. Like, the Democrats, they're out of power, so what do they have to lose by saying something? It's not like, Republicans, I understand that they've got to, I know they don't all agree with this, but they're, like, afraid of the consequences of speaking out. But like, initially, Susan Collins, she was challenging Pete Hegseth, but you saw, if you followed those hearings, eventually they all kind of went with the program. So I'm not sure we can, it's a good use of energy to focus on the Republicans. But the Democrats have been unnecessarily silent because they're out of power. But in this one, I mean, like, when people study this period, I do think, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying it's going to be like the Salem witch trials. It's like, what were these people thinking? Because it's like, these are just lies. And everybody, oh, no, that's okay. It's like, what?
Yes, I understand. So someone asked, are there any newsletters or social media accounts that you follow to stay informed on the anti-racist movements?
Not really. I was born in 1957, so I am on social media, but I don't rely on it. I watch Democracy Now! Regularly. I started watching Al Jazeera with the Gaza situation because I just realized, and the October 7th was an atrocity, but it was treated in an ahistorical way, in that people were not willing to look at the history. And that doesn't excuse what happened, but if you don't understand that, then you can't so that's why we got somebody talking about building a resort in Gaza, and thinks that's gonna happen. Just yesterday they put out a AI-generated video at Gaza. I know that's not what you asked, but
No, it's okay.
And I'm not against social media. There are great podcasts that are out there. I would say use whatever you have access to. Often social media is reaching people that people like me are not reaching, because they're not necessarily looking at, the books. And this is not my core area of scholarship, but because I'm looking at race and real estate, like, you can't ignore this because it's going to impact everybody.
Yeah. Okay. For our last question, we're just going to ask, can you talk a little more about the Roy and Trump's visions being similar?
Can you say that again, please?
Can you talk more about Roy and Trump's visions being similar?
Wait, Roy.
Roy. It was the person that you brought up in your lecture on one of your slides. Yes.
Oh, McCarthy. It's not so much the vision. So it was Roy Cohn. He was an attorney. And so he was still living when I lived in New York. And so, like, he was known. I lived in New York from 82 to 2012. He had a reputation of being hard-charging, a shark. And so Donald Trump's tactic as a businessman has been to use the law to silence his enemies. This is what he did as a businessman, and to not pay people who work for him, because he didn't do that as a developer, right? He would not pay people. And I'm not saying Roy Cohn had anything to do with that, but definitely the legal side, he definitely. And so when you look at what's happened recently with the firings at the federal government, it's like they're moving quickly and leaving it up to other people to take them to court. And I am certain that they think they're going to wear people down in court. And that's why I wanted you to see that the ACLU has a $146 million budget. Because, okay, it's like, and if you remember, I don't know if you saw last week, I think she's a congresswoman from Connecticut. She was at a meeting with Donald Trump, a Democrat, and she did speak up. He said something about, I can't remember what the issue was. He asked her, was she going to be getting rid of DEI or something like that? And she said, oh, I don't think there's a need to do that. And he said, well, we'll see about that. And she said, I'll see you in court. And that's what he wants. Yeah, because he's trying to scare people thinking they're afraid, but like without the law, that's why Thurgood Marshall, we know him so well, because he understood street activism, protest is important, but the law is important. And the conservatives understand that too. That's why they made a point of putting judges in place who they believe will favor them. And so the law is a very important part of this. And that's what Roy Cohn helped Donald Trump understand, and that's what he's carrying out now. And, yeah.
I see. We actually have time for one more question, so we'll just do one more.
I was going to say, oh,
no.
So I talked too long.
No, you're fine. How do you react to extremist groups such as Turning Point building their credibility by misrepresenting marginalized groups in policy?
I mean, I've heard of them. I don't know them specifically. I mean, if they are a white supremacist group, by definition, white supremacy requires inferiority of people of color. Because otherwise, it just, and so when we separate that out, it means that white people should be dominant all the time, everywhere. And if you believe that, then you believe that people of color should not have even a foot in the door. And so you're going to find all kinds of reasons to explain why that should happen. And that's why I made the point. So Pete Hegseth has white supremacist links. And they knew that when he was being considered as Secretary of Defense. He's never run, like the nonprofits I ran were probably as big as the ones he ran. I'm not trying to be Secretary of Defense. So for him, that's why I point out C.Q. Brown, like the atrocity. And that's why, so what they're doing is creating an atmosphere where just the presence of a black person in a job leads somebody to question their qualification. And they didn't manufacture that, that happens. So as a black man who attended Harvard, graduated from it, I've had to, it's kind of like a living experience where white person says something, black person says something, they listen to the white person, not the black person. But they're just bringing it out of the shadows. And so that's why he said, I don't know if C.K. Brown got that job because of he was black. And it's like, well, how'd you get your job? You know, like, so, and nobody's asking that question. No, and Claudine Gay, president of Harvard, for 6 months. The Harvard Corporation, when people were questioning how she got that job, they did not say. She was the head of all of the undergraduate and graduate programs for 6 years before she became president. They didn't say that. And so that allowed that lie that she's only there, and Christopher Rufo had a lot to do with that. That allowed that lie to stand. And so white supremacy requires black inferiority, Latino inferiority. Asian people are kind of, I think to some extent, being played in this. When you hear, so Donald Trump in China, there's a particular kind of hostility that white supremacists have had to Asian people. That's why we had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, when Chinese couldn't even come here. And so even though my research is focusing on black people, there's corollary for other people of color. And that's what is, it's not confounding, but it's frustrating when you see people of color who think they're going to benefit from being associated with this administration. Short term maybe, but he doesn't care about them. No.
Okay, thank you. So, as we wrap up, let's give a big thank you to Dr. Kevin McGruder for sharing his knowledge. For sharing his knowledge, insight, and wisdom with us today. Please, let's give him another round of applause. So, if there's one thing to take away from this, is that we all have the power to be agents of change, advocating for equity and inclusion in our communities.